Hello, Contrarian Dude here, and recently I did a video called Without Government, the Rich Will Get Richer, Rebutted. And it got lots of different comments, but there's another angle I want to take. I talked a little bit about the philosophy of why that happens there, but I want to talk about the actual results here, and I would say it's beyond a shadow of a doubt at this point. So the last several decades have just given us a phenomenal experiment involving billions of people to kind of prove the case here. So let's take America. 20, 30 years ago, very, very rich country by world standards. And let's take China, one of the poorest countries in the world by world standards. A huge disparity there, right? Several decades ago, they create free trade agreements. Now, what free trade agreements are, and often they don't have that much to do with free trade, granted. There's a whole bunch of stuff going there, but I just want to talk about the basics are this. Anybody in either of those countries could buy any products from the other countries and employ anybody at any rate. There was no minimum wage. Like, you could employ someone in China for $2 a month. It's fine. There was no minimum wage. It was just unbridled, free market. Anyone can employ anything, whatever the market would bear, and that's what it was. Now, the theory is that you're told, that you're taught in school, is that without some kind of government overruling the free market, then the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. What we should have seen is that America gets even wealthier and China gets even poorer. But we just know that that's not what happened. Everybody knows that. The wealthy country got poorer, and the poor country got wealthier. Wealth flowed in just incredible amounts to the point where hundreds of millions of people have been lifted up out of poverty in China because of these free trade agreements. There was it was a torrent of wealth over the last few decades from rich to poor. And you can't explain that without acknowledging that unbridled freedom, unbridled free market, laissez-faire markets achieve that result. The premise that the rich abuse the poor and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer is just complete bullshit. That's not how markets work. I mean, this experiment involved over 1 billion people. It involved over 1/6 of the world's population. That's a statistically significant experiment. And we could do it with other countries as well, similar kind of results in India. So now let's take a look at what happened within those two countries, right? So within the United States, from 40, 50 years ago, the role of government has massively expanded, right? It's a much, much bigger organization than before. And we see the distribution of wealth has just changed dramatically. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer within the United States. But that happened not because of free markets, because of the opposite, because of the expansion of government. Now let's go over and take a look at China. Now, China is still a totalitarian state. It's still not even in the ballpark of freedom. But on the spectrum in the last 30, 40 years, they have moved from totalitarianism towards freedom. And from that, they have seen a decrease in the distribution of wealth. The middle class has massively expanded. Just there, in the space of 3 minutes, I've explained this 1 billion person experiment, a 300 million person experiment, and a 1.3 billion person experiment. And every time it holds that the rich, you don't need government intervention to stop the rich getting richer and the poor get poorer. The market does it relatively well. Now, I'm not suggesting that under free markets, there's going to be this absolute equality and, everyone's going to have the same amount of money. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. Obviously, there's going to be rich and very, very, very rich, and there's going to be poor and very, very, very poor. I get that. But it's nowhere near the horror story that you think it is, and it's certainly nowhere near the disaster of government intervention. When government treats people unequally in an attempt to try and create an equal economic outcome, almost exclusively it happens that the wealth gap grows. Now, it is true that you can find exemptions to this, and so you can find the opposite. In other places in the world, there are instances of where the government increased in size and the distribution of wealth narrowed, the wealth gap narrowed. It's possible, I get that. But what I'm saying is there are a lot of people running around saying there's simply no other option. We have to have government to protect us from this massive wealth gap inequality. And that is not true. There is a ton of evidence and a ton of data to suggest the exact opposite. You see, under free markets, wealth and resources flow to where they are given the highest utility, to where they're treated best. And so there's obviously some people who have better skills than others at managing resources and producing outcomes from those resources. So wealth doesn't distribute itself perfectly even. It distributes itself where it gets the most benefit. Now, the ability to manage, if I've got to manage one little item of resource, I can put all my efforts to that. And even though I may not have the greatest skill set at it, I can do a pretty good job. To manage lots of resources, it becomes harder and harder and harder. And that's why, even though there's obviously going to be a discrepancy in intellect and talent, and some people are just born really smart or with economic vision or with entrepreneurial skill, whatever it is, yes, more money is going to gravitate towards those people. But there's a very strong limitation on that, in that it's so hard to manage all of these resources. And that's why in free markets, that's why it tends to generally be quite a narrow wealth gap, and it's a pretty consistent thing. But in totalitarian markets, well, now you have very different distribution. You can go all the way from, you can go from the totalitarian Cuba or Russia or China, where just the ruling elite have everything and others have very, very little. And then you can have other experiments like Scandinavia is doing a reasonably good job. Australia is doing a reasonably good job, where massive taxes, large government involved in every aspect of your life, huge welfare programs. And for a time, they seem to work quite well. And even if we grant the fantasy that this centrally planned concentration of power in this small government doesn't corrupt over time, and let's say that these socialist countries last for generations or centuries even if you grant that, you have to acknowledge that part of this category of central planning, you also get the Cubas and the Russias and the Chinas, as well as the Australias and the Norways and the Swedens, right? That is all in the same camp. There's another concept that you might want to be thoughtful of here as well, which is socialism. Most families are socialist, sharing money with your children and whatever else. And, the husband and wife go to work and they just pool the resources. It's not like, one partner gets to spend more than the other. So on the family level, pretty much all families are socialist. The larger you get, the bigger the population, then the harder it is for socialism to work. For a couple of reasons. When you're only managing 3, 4, 5 people, it is possible, there's so much communication, everyone can understand each other's what they want, and it is possible for 1 or 2 people to kind of understand everything that needs to be understood in the ecosystem. But as population increases, this gets harder and harder and harder, and also the potential for corruption is more and more and more and more, and each person's vote, each person's say gets reduced to the point where it becomes insignificant. So if someone does something wrong or immoral, or if there's if there's a gambler in the household and they squander the family's money, they can call them out on it, they can take the money off them, there's more control in that environment. But in a government with tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats, and there's 300 million people voting, and some are voting this way, some are voting that way, all of a sudden the details get lost and the ability for corruption gets much, much larger. So if you're going to advocate for socialism, you absolutely have to advocate for very, very small, small nation states. Very, very small. And if maybe you have taxation at the state level or the local level, and you start separating things. But this idea of a global socialist government is absolutely insane. The bigger the population, the harder socialist goals are to achieve under a socialist government. So we kind of went on a few tangents there, but the point I really want to impress upon you is this mantra that without government, that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and there's this massive gap between rich and poor. That is not true. That does not happen in free markets. It simply does not. It does happen, although it's not guaranteed to happen, under centrally planned economies. But it does not happen in the free market. It's just not true, so please push back against that false narrative. It has to be destroyed. This is one of the, people are so terrified of that they just, don't let me live in a world with this huge disparity of wealth, and they cling on to government, and it's just a total lie. You've got to push back against it and start educating people. So guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please like it, share it, subscribe. I'll see you soon. Take care.